Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I come to you very belatedly with a terrific tag, the Top 10 Nonfiction Books Tag, put together by Lukas at Totally Pretentious. I was tagged by both Lukas, the originator of the tag, and by Alex at What Page Are You On? My apologies for the delay. Before I get into my top 10 list, I want to tell you a little bit about a vaguely bookish event I went to this weekend, a Great Gatsby-era party at the home of one of my husband David's young colleagues. We got all dressed up, David in his tuxedo and a top hat, and I in a vaguely flapper-style top, a pair of formal black palazzo pants, and a sparkly headscarf. For the first time, I think, we had the experience of being the oldest people at the party, a new experience for us. Let me show you just a few pictures of us dressed to the nines. Okay, onto the nonfiction tag. Let me start by saying that I'm terrible at ranking favorites in any systematic way, and I'm not even going to try. I'm also not very good at math. Assuming you are, you might notice that my top 10 list is a little top-heavy. Like Roz at Scallydandling, I'm naming some favorite nonfiction books in no particular order, but ending with my number one choice. And like Alex at What Page Are You On? I'm presenting my choices in pairs of related books, although my categories are much less thoughtful than his. First, I'll mention two books that meant a lot to me when I was a young reader, by authors who've continued to mean a lot to me over the years. The first is Eudora Welty's One Writer's Beginnings. In this slim volume, she paints this detailed portrait of the minutiae, the everyday details that flowed through her life as a child and as a young woman growing up white in the U.S. South, showing how all those plain moments contain deep and metaphorical meaning. Welty talks subtly and thoughtfully about how important her memories of family and community echo in her work, and how experiences of racial hierarchy thread through it all. If you're a writer or a reader, this book is one I highly recommend. Since my early high school days, Welty has been one of my favorite authors of short stories. I've recently discovered that Welty herself narrates an audiobook version of One Writer's Beginnings, and I'm eager to listen to it. Perhaps in July, when Brian at Bookish reads Welty for his short story project. Welty's memoir is joined by a Flannery OConnor collection of letters called The Habit of Being. O'Connor is now perhaps my very favorite author, but I admit that I didn't feel that way at all when I was young. The first time I read her short stories, I was stunned to see this woman I thought was religious, that is, what I assumed was prim, writing what I saw as in-your-face horror stories. It took me a little while to adjust my assumptions and start understanding how her faith and her regional identity combined to create her work that isn't horror by any means, but sometimes cuts through history like an axe. I picked up this collection of the author's letters only to discover that while I might have been a little afraid of her if she were actually a neighbor, I knew she would be living with me for the rest of my life. First, her discussion of religion exposed me to radically different understandings of what faith could do. I grew up in a totally secular family, surrounded by Protestants who were pretty quiet about how faith worked in their lives. Flannery OConnor was not that way. She talks about her Catholic beliefs, conservative pre-Vatican II beliefs, in ways that I found deeply interesting, not as religious beliefs or political beliefs, but as a model for the way a writer or a person can live one's beliefs, even when they aren't always popular beliefs. My favorite line of hers that I think applies to a wide variety of situations, religious and not, is, "The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it emotionally." At the same time that I started understanding her seriousness as a writer, I was also incredibly taken with her sharp wit. In both her letters and her stories, O'Connor is incredibly funny, often sarcastic, and full of wordplay. I'll be talking about a few of the jokes in her stories a bit more when Brian reads O'Connor in June for his short story project. One note about both Welty and O'Connor. They were white women living in the South at a time of great racial injustice, and while both of them were able to be visionary in their perceptions of what was happening and what should happen, both of these authors were also very much products of their time. O'Connor especially uses distressing language about race, even when her larger point is not something distressing. It might be worth knowing that before you jump in, if you're new to these authors, just to put it in context. The next two books are works of academic history that are both accessible to general readers. I've mentioned the work of Drew Faust before, but I haven't mentioned my very favorite of her works, James Henry Hammond and the Old South, A Design for Mastery, published in 1985. When Faust's study was first published, it was an eye-opening study of how the expression of power works in a society. Hammond was from a relatively humble background, but he created himself as one of the most powerful people in South Carolina in the antebellum period, the period before the U.S. Civil War. Faust traces how Hammond's ambition and search for power and control played out on an economic field, on the political field, and even in his familial and personal life, including his very personal life. One of the things that I find important in this book is its articulation of the fact that power came from a combination of the supposedly traditional or conservative culture of the South with a progressive and highly capitalist idea of progress. That idea is now taken for granted in academic history. For example, works like Ed Baptist's masterful and more recent work on slavery, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, radically extends that argument and develops the argument more fully, applying it to the actual experience of enslaved people much more directly. Hammond's book is joined in the history section by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's fantastic book, A Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary, 1785 to 1812, a book published in 1991. It went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. The title of this book makes it sound like this is simply a biography of Ballard, a woman from 18th century Maine who was a midwife and healer as well as a diarist. But Ulrich minds this incredibly mundane diary, an account where Ballard rarely wrote about her ideas or personal perspectives on what was happening, to give us an amazing portrait of everything from women's work lives and domestic lives to medical care of the time, sexual mores in a Puritan region, religious divisions, and many other details about daily life on the New England frontier soon after the American Revolution. For scholars, seeing how much historical information about a whole society could be mined from what seemed to many people like a fairly extensive but boring individual diary has been transformative. But for readers at large, seeing how Ulrich used the diary to develop an incredible narrative full of the kinds of plots and characterizations that you might expect in a novel is perhaps even more impressive. The third pair of nonfiction books, which I'll list, are about raising a child. Of these, the first is Brian Hall's lovely 1997 book, Madelines World, A Child's Journey from Birth to Age 3. The paperback edition has a different subtitle, A Biography of a 3-Year-Old. I believe David and I read this book aloud to each other while I was pregnant, as we tried to imagine the world ahead of us. Hall's book is not a parenting book at all, but rather an imaginative investigation or a rumination on how humans think about ourselves and about the world, and how that process begins. All along the way, Hall considers how literature plays a part in the process of becoming a human. Let me read the questions the publisher raises when trying to explain what this book is about. What might it feel like to be 6 months old, to have only recently discovered that your hands are your own, and that not all round things are breasts, or to celebrate your first birthday when you don't understand first and birth yet, and aren't sure about day, or to wonder what the moon is and whether it's farther away than airplanes or the flies on the ceiling, or to first figure out that books tell a story, or that places stay and time passes. What might be the shape of your first inkling that you have a past, that words represent things, that you can imagine something that isn't true, that you're getting bigger, that your parents are fallible, that your will and theirs are not the same, that things die, and so will you. Although I haven't read this book in 2 decades, I still think about it regularly, and in fact recommended it at least twice in the last month, basically whenever I have a nerdy or philosophical friend about to become a parent. Madelines World got our parenting off to the right start, I think, a start based on wonder and amazement at this newly minted person coming into full humanity in our midst. Paired with Madelines World in this parenting group is David Albert's classic 1999 memoir and the Skylark Sings with Me, Adventures in Homeschooling and Community-Based Education. I mentioned this book when I did the Have Steve Donahue Read It tag a couple of months ago. The book was instrumental in my family's life. Although I know this book won't be meaningful to everyone watching, it is certainly more than just a homeschooling manual. Skylark Sings has 3 central themes as I see it. First, it shows us how important it is to really listen to our children and their needs, not to decide ourselves all the time about what we think is the right thing for them. Second, Albert shows us how much there is in our communities to help our children and ourselves learn about the world. We might not instinctively reach out to a group of grown-ups when our child wants to know about astronomy, as Albert talks about, or folk music and folk dance, which is one of the major loves our own child has. But those adults are often ecstatic about sharing what they know and love with curious young people. Education doesn't have to happen with people exactly our own age in mandated educational settings. Very little has influenced our family's ideas about education more than this author's perspective. Finally, this book reinforced to me how nice it is when parents are able to embrace the wonder, embrace the delight in watching a child grow up. For the 4th pairing, I'm thinking about faith and doubt. I mentioned that I grew up completely secular. Although I've never believed in God, I have been fascinated by issues of faith and doubt, as well as by the assorted religious practices of the faithful. I spent some time going to Quaker meeting and Quaker anti-war groups, and I've spent more time reading about Judaism and Jewish people from perspectives ranging from the historical to works about current orthodoxy to approaches more aligned with feminism and environmentalism and other social justice movements. Perhaps my favorite book from that last section is Judith Plaskows' Standing Again at Sinai, a book from 30 years ago that critiques the patriarchal nature of traditional Judaism in a non-polemic but highly analytical way. She's interested in the question of how increasing participation of women, as well as the increasing influence of feminism, will shape Judaism into a more inclusive faith. Plaskow points out that since women have been traditionally excluded from the spiritual path of legal study and argument, she suggests that women might have developed other avenues to God more fully. Hers is a much more nuanced study than what I think my description might imply. If these general issues are of interest to you, I think her book is definitely worth a read. The second book in this fourth category is Doubt, a History, the Great Doubters and Their Legacy of Innovation from Socrates and Jesus to Thomas Jefferson and Emily Dickinson by Jennifer Michael Hecht. As I'm sure you can tell from the subtitle, this is not a book about atheism at all. Instead, it's a book about questioning, about valuing the possibilities of changing one's ideas. Hecht considers how doubt, and sometimes full disbelief, are at the heart of the Western mind. She looks at examples ranging from the early Greeks, Hebrew figures such as Job and Ecclesiastes, and Roman Stoicism, to Jesus as a man of doubt, to Christian mystics, and to Jewish and Christian skeptics, and then on to secularism and the rise of science, to modern and contemporary critical thinkers such as Darwin or Marx. At a time when I was trying to decide if I could write a book myself, a book that I was imagining as part memoir and part academic exploration about living without faith, a friend, a brilliant older man who had been a professor of religion for many years, gave me this book and talked me through many of my questions. For personal reasons, including some unrelated practical reasons, I didn't continue with my plans for that book, but it might still be in me. Certainly, Hecht's book Doubt will have been fundamental in whatever emerges. I especially recommend this book to Lukas at Totally Pretentious, the originator of this tag, who I suspect would find some of the author's arguments interesting. The next pair of books are two about the politics of food. Fast Food Nation, The Dark Side of the American Meal by Eric Schlosser, and Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. David and I listened to Fast Food Nation as an audiobook when it first came out, on a long drive from our home in Washington, D.C. to South Carolina, and then to South Florida as we visited family and friends. I picked up Schlosser's book primarily to hear his analysis of how capitalism shaped both our food choices and food production in the United States. What I came away with was much deeper, more personal. Schlosser's portraits of workers in processing plants, as well as retail establishments, was powerful, not just a theoretical critique, but a visceral one. When we were at home, we very rarely ate at chain restaurants, but on the road during a long drive was another story. We decided after the first chapter that we would not be stopping at any chain restaurants along the highway as we drove and drove and drove. We found plenty of what my father used to call mom-and-pop restaurants, knowing that much of the food they served was also probably from some of the processing plants Schlosser discussed, but still feeling that we had to do something differently. I'm not sure I'd feel the same way about this book now, but when I first read it, it was transformative. A few years later, Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, came out, after David and I were already quite involved in the local food movement, and after we had lived as primarily vegetarians for decades. I love the way Pollan writes, and I enjoyed the structure of his book as well. Like in his earlier book, The Botany of Desire, he writes about 4 separate stories, interconnected by a general theme. Palin's work seemed more story-driven and less politically driven than Schlosser's book. His book is less an expose than it is an exploration, a series of questions. And I think his respectful questions made it possible for many more readers to engage in issues about the politics of food than if he'd been more prescriptive. Some of our friends were appalled by his permission to eat meat if it was acquired in what he feels is a sustainable way. If you're a vegan and disturbed by these ideas, you might choose to read just the first chapter on corn processing. And just like with Schlosser's book, this one was awfully powerful when it came out, but the world has moved on a bit, and Palin's ideas were so influential that at this point his book might seem overdone. Imagine you're sitting through Hamlet, listening to cliché after cliché, not realizing that Shakespeare made almost all of them up. Palin's book might be the same way. I'll go on to list my very favorite nonfiction book of all time, When the Spirit Catches You, You Fall Down, by Anne Fadiman. I've done a whole video on just this book, so I won't talk about it here, but I will link to that video below. Thanks, Lukas, for putting together this great tag, and thanks to all of you for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.